CNN recently had a climate crisis town hall with Democrat candidates for the 2020 presidential election. With all the hype, it's hard to get to the truth about climate change. Pete Buttigieg calls it a moral crisis. People like Bernie Sanders love to say they believe the scientists, but they never get around to having an informed dialogue about the actual science. And what they don't tell you is that not all scientists agree with their conclusions, and they conspicuously leave out the fact that much of the science runs contrary to their narrative that human activity has created a climate crisis. So let's take a look at some of the actual science behind climate change. One of the main talking points of climate change alarmists is that increased carbon output into the Earth's atmosphere is causing global temperatures to rise. So how true is this? Well, scientific research has produced data from ice core samples going all the way back 150,000 years, which shows that carbon dioxide levels increase after temperatures did, not before. Research also shows that there's about an 800-year lag between when temperature rises and when CO2 levels increase. In fact, between 1999 and 2003, a series of peer-reviewed papers in scholarly journals came out showing that carbon levels rise hundreds of years after temperature, not before. If you're asking yourself why you never heard this, the answer is pretty simple. There's a media blackout. Professor Robert Geigengach, chair of the Department of Earth and Environmental Science, is another one of many mainstream academics who agree. He said claims that our temperature increases are solely because of more CO2 are incredibly misleading. He said, as temperature rises, CO2 rises and vice versa. Variations in planetary alignment are most likely responsible. When gravitation from other planets' orbits causes the Earth to move closer to or further from the sun, temperatures increase or decrease. Another scientist, Professor Nir Shaviv at the Rocca Institute of Physics, participated in a debate on climate at Cambridge University, where he reminded his audience that there is no single piece of evidence that proves that a given amount of CO2 increase should cause a large increase in temperature. He also reminded the audience that people pushing the man-made climate change narrative should be able to convince you with evidence, not fallacious arguments. Appeals to authority prove nothing. And some arguments that may seem scientific actually aren't, like the fact that evidence for warming is not necessarily evidence for warming by humans. What else do they tell you? That 97% of scientists agree with the theory of man-made climate change. Now here's what they don't tell you. The 97% consensus claim began with a man named John Cook, who released a report after claiming to have examined more than 12,000 papers on man-made climate change. He said 97% of them endorsed a human-caused global warming. But as it turns out, only 41 of the 11,944 published climate papers that he examined explicitly stated that man caused most of the warming since 1950. And let's not forget that the North Pole was supposed to melt by the year 2013. But as it turns out, in 2014, the polar ice caps were thicker and covered a record number of square miles because of increases in ice. Let's also remember that the Earth hasn't gotten any warmer in the last 20 years. And finally, let's get to the big picture. The fact of the matter is, the concept of man-made climate change is simply the boogeyman that's supposed to push the world toward global governance. Nothing more, nothing less. DICE stands for the Draft International Covenant on Environment and Development. It's considered the environmental constitution of global governance. The first version of the covenant was presented to the United Nations in 1995 on the occasion of its 50th anniversary. It was hoped that it would become a negotiating document for a global treaty on environmental conservation and sustainable development. The fourth version of the covenant, issued on September 22nd of 2010, was written to control all development tied to the environment, the highest form of law for all human activity. The covenant's 79 articles take sustainable development principles described in the UN's Agenda 21 and transform them into global law, which supersedes all constitutions, including the U.S. Constitution. All signatory nations, including the U.S., would become centrally planned socialist countries in which all decisions would be made within the framework of sustainable development. And let's not forget the statement by the UN official who admitted the real goal of the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change was not to save the world from ecological calamity, but to destroy capitalism. Now, there's a lot more to get into, but even if you aren't well versed on the science behind climate change, you can completely dismantle the official narrative on man-made climate change with little logical reasoning.
And let's just for a moment say that it is true. That means that the best scenario vis-a-vis global warming is about 10 feet raise in water. That's the best scenario over the next 40, 50 years. That's the best scenario. The worst scenario is about 100 feet. But let's just take the 10 feet. If the water on the planet is going to rise up 10 feet, that means the southern part of the United States is gone. England is gone. Most of Europe is gone. And I can go, most of Central America is gone. Okay, if that's the case, let's just take Florida, for example, which is one of the fastest growing beachfront condominiums on the planet. In the prospectus, when you invest, there should be, in the footnotes, if global warming is for real, they won't put it that way, global warming happens and water rises 10 feet, this investment you made is all. Not one single investment prospectus written since 2000, this century, has alluded to global warming. Not one motherfucker. If it were really true, the banks wouldn't invest. The banks wouldn't finance. Not one motherfucking condominium. So the people that have the money, and I'm jealous of the Vice President, Gore. I am jealous he came up with a scam before I did. Because the financial institutions, the banks of this world know it's not going to happen. Otherwise, you couldn't get a loan in London. You know those 30, 40-year mortgages? The world will be over by then. Is Barclays Bank going to give you a motherfucking loan? With the greatest respect, ma'am, it's the greatest fraud that's been perpetrated on mankind this century.